So, Luke, what was the last thing you searched on Google or ChatGPT?
Puns. I'm really bad at coming up with puns myself. Me and my friends have this group chat about puns. So I've been cheating a bit. I'm not going to lie. And I had to come up with some puns for me.
I told you we'd make you sweat in this podcast. Woo! Welcome to another episode of the Open Metaverse podcast, where we deep dive into all things Web3. I'm your host, Mo, and today we have a special guest, Luke, the CTO and CEO of Pixels. Mehdi, my co-host, is also here to join the conversation. How are you doing today, Luke?
Doing good. It's been super busy here at Pixels lately, but that's a good thing, I guess. So yeah, no, getting through it, feeling good, feeling really energized about the next steps.
I love it. I mean, we're so excited to have you. I know, obviously, we've been working on some of the tokenomics together behind the scenes. So I guess we might as well jump straight in. Let's start with your background. Tell us a bit of your crypto origin story and the inspiration behind Pixels, and maybe a small touch on CTO and CEO. It's not often we see that within the space as well.
Yeah, totally. So I actually have a technical background. I started coding when I was like 12. And weirdly enough, I was kind of around crypto at a really young age as well. I learned about Bitcoin in like 2013, 2014. I started mining it in my parents' computer. But then, I went off to university. I studied computer science and economics. I chose economics because I was super interested in it. I thought it'd be completely useless. And funny enough, in our economics classes, we went over Bitcoin a few times. And I was actually like drilled about how terrible Bitcoin was. I was just like all about speculation and stuff like that too. So I actually had like a pretty negative connotation of crypto for a long time. Especially after graduating, going out into the real world. But yeah, I ended up starting working as a software engineer for a little bit, and then eventually ended up starting this company called Mesh, which turned into Pixels. So Mesh wasn't a Web3 company; it was kind of like a metaverse company, though. We kind of pioneered this new technology called spatial video chat, which was essentially creating like virtual persistent spaces. We used this technology to sell to enterprise companies. So we basically hosted like happy hours, mixers, and other interesting, engaging events online for companies like Apple, Uber, Rippling, and Twitter. But that business wasn't quite working. What we found with virtual spaces is that, if we gave people a virtual space, we didn't see very consistent usage if they were just hanging out in it. We see like a bunch of metaverse platforms kind of doing the same thing right now. But we realized we needed to make a bit of a change. And what we were really interested in was gaming, in order to increase retention, in order to make these spaces, something that people would use every single day. And then at the same time, what was really interesting is one of our most popular use cases for the product was actually an NFT collection called Pixel Beast. And they had been bugging me so much about putting their NFTs into like our platform to walk around as them. And I just wrote them off at first. But then it's funny, they offered us like $20,000 to do it. And I'm like, oh, this is a bit more interesting to me now. We started digging into the use case and we saw all these NFT collections out there that essentially had these NFTs that had nothing to do with them, but they had really strong communities. So we started actually doing these NFT integrations into the platform. And we saw really high engagement with our Web3 audience where, it kind of opened up this new form of distribution where we could do these partnerships with these NFT collections, which is now, people call it interoperability. But we were able to do these like basically permissionless reads of NFT collections, and kind of we started building the Web3 ethos that way. So it was like a simultaneous pivot of moving into gaming, and then getting really into Web3 with these other NFT collections that we were working with, and made us very convinced that Web3 gaming was a very interesting way for us to go.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, Luke. I know you mentioned technology and community, but I just wanted to dive a bit deeper into the technology stack. Like, what were some of the rationales of using Web3 for Pixels?
Yeah, so Web3 tech is interesting, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that you still have to build that you might not think that you have to build. And it's very much deep tech, which for me as a founder, that's actually really good founder market fit, because this tech that we built before was very hard tech to build, these virtual persistent spaces. it's like a bunch of DevOps, Kubernetes, and like, some really unique stuff there. So that was also partly what attracted me to Web3, where the tech is extremely hard to build. And, that gives my team an edge because, we can actually build harder things. So, rather than like competing one-to-one with a game studio, now we're competing with game studios, but we have that technical edge. And that's what also really attracted me to that space.
Luke, just to follow on, so we spoke about the technology aspect of Web3. Were there any interesting economic aspects that you thought were interesting to incorporate within Pixels and which Web2 cannot offer?
Yeah. So what really also attracted me to Web3 was the idea of like designing an economy ground up. That was just like a personal thing where I'm like, this is the coolest thing. And the fact that I get to be touching this kind of stuff is super interesting. But, we've also learned a lot of stuff around incentive design. And we've, really experimented a lot with how Web3 can help projects grow. And this is something that we, started off in our early days. We did something that was relatively unique at the time in order to mint our initial NFT. We did what we called like a play to mint, essentially. So we put up a leaderboard, and only the top 2,000 people in this game demo that we released could mint our NFT. And then, we kind of thought about it like game theory. We put like a limited time to this like leaderboards. We gave people 2 weeks to play the game. It created this crazy sense of urgency. We had this real-time leaderboard that was updating when people would play the game. So, they could see if they were going down in the ranks, things like that. And it created like this, higher level incentive design of like, engage with our product and then you get to mint this NFT. Or, exhibit good behavior in our ecosystem, playing our game, giving us feedback, helping us test it. And then you get to be, a part of this ecosystem too. And we've kept that ethos in basically everything that we've done in the future too. We had a really big growth spurt in October, taking this to the next level, where we played around more with like direct token and incentive design. Basically, incentivizing you to share to Twitter, incentivizing you to, refer friends with token incentives. And we saw insane growth with that. So to me, that's kind of the whole point of Web3. Actually, at the end of the day now, it's actually like, essentially for us, we think about it like subsidized CAC. We think about it like increased retention or like ways to, facilitate the end effect that we want in a game without like, cost to us, or at least like subsidized cost through these token incentives where, we get to build a network, we get to build an ecosystem and then reward good behavior with these incentives. It's really cool. I'm so fascinated by it.
And that is really interesting. I love that subsidized CAC. I can't say I've heard that one before, but it makes so much more sense when it's articulated in that way. And I think pulling on something that you said as well, it's the activation within Web3 is rather easy. So retention is quite challenging, and with a focus on good behavior. And again, with the incentive mechanisms, you've seen that growth, I'm guessing month on month as well, especially that growth spurt in October. Wow. So moving on, could you give us a rundown on what Pixels is and what's so special about the game that keeps the community coming back? I know we've touched on this, but what else sets it apart from other Web3 games?
Yeah, so one of the things I think that we did really well early on was we started with community. The game that we released initially was just like a bare bones demo that nobody really would want to be playing on its own, but we had built community around it, and we did it very differently than a lot of the Web3 projects at the time. We had really strict rules in our Discord, for example, like do not talk about floor price. If you talk about the price of our NFT, you're out of the Discord, which at that time was not very popular, but it actually set the really good base for our community, where we actually developed like a large group of people who liked what we're building, who, had some part of ownership through our NFTs, through what we're building too. And there was like, just better alignment with the long-term vision. So we could use that community in the future to, support us through the rest of the stuff. And then they became our biggest fans too. Like essentially the NFT mint was, a crazy growth hack to get 1,000 true fans, instantly basically. And then, the other thing that we did too was we looked at games that have high retention inherently. And the types of games that I'm personally into are, farm games. And those games are, very, very retentive in nature, where, you do an action and you have to come back the next day or your crops might die. We wanted something psychological where like, we want people to feel, I don't want to say guilty, but, we want them to feel like they have to come back the next day or else the progress that they made might, not, show up. So the farm game fits that really well. It's essentially like a very retentive game loop that gets people coming back every single day. And combined with the Web3 incentives, it's like, good baseline of retention through gameplay, through community, and like really super fans. And then, the Web3 growth incentives, like that's how we've been thinking about things.
Super interesting that we go down farming. I remember when Facebook first became the de facto platform, Farmville was a game everyone was playing regardless of age, and it was that hook that kept you coming back. Wow. So we've heard about the token utility of pixels. Can you explain how it works and what benefits it provides to the different stakeholders?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about the pixel token, like one, we need to frame it from like a burn perspective or like a utility perspective first. Like, what does this token do? And then we can also think about how we distribute it to like facilitate good in-game behavior, like behavior that we think will grow the ecosystem essentially. So yeah, it's funny because I see some tokens get dropped and like I actually have no idea what they do. Like some tokens, they'll do governance, things like that. But for us, we wanted to focus on like, okay, what is an actual player who is holding this token going to do, and how can we get them to use this token as much as possible? So one, we needed a game where we actually could see and analyze where people are spending their time, energy, resources, and the in-game tokens they have right now before we ever released Pixel. So what's great is we actually released the game and we have a ton of data that we can pull from where it's like, okay, people value this area of our game, with this soft currency that I have released in X dollar amount, and these are the things that we're looking to put Pixel into now. So essentially, we're thinking about premium, in-game items. Essentially, we're going to do like this new mechanic pretty soon called pets. We're really excited about that, and that's going to be like a very core part of the pixel burn loop. And then we're also thinking about other areas as well, like people are dying for upgrades in game to things like their backpack. Essentially, anything that feels like a bit more premium or what a game would typically use a hard currency for is what we're planning on using Pixel for. And then we also have this whole other side of things too, where we've been developing, user-generated tooling, essentially, where people can actually make content in our game, like new objects, new items, new rooms, and even new game mechanics. It's essentially like this layer of SaaS that we built out, that we had already built out in our previous business, that we want to start opening up to our users, where we know we have a software that people would be paying money for it, and we actually want to use our token for that software. We provided something of value. And we know this is like a pretty consistent way to sync that value when we're not even thinking about the Web3 side of things. So we are going to be using this tooling to be a primary sync of that pixel token as well. So essentially, we're thinking about like two different personas. We're thinking about creators and we're thinking about users. And then what we're thinking about in terms of distribution of the token is, okay, one, how can we reward people to basically funnel more primary sales to that pixel token? So for us, that's things like playing the game a lot. Users that play the game a lot will probably be spending the pixel token more. Two, it's rewarding creators who bring more players to the game or who create experiences that engage players a lot of the time. So if you are building on our tooling and you make an experience that's getting people to play a lot, that will probably be using Pixel more, then we want to also reward you with this token as well. So we kind of think about it almost on a protocol level too, where it's really the system of incentive design that we can use to help grow the ecosystem to do all that. And we can only grow the ecosystem if this token is actually useful and if it's actually getting spent.
And I think something probably for our listeners at home to note as well, that there is a soft currency in game called the Berry token. So it will be a dual currency ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. Part of the reason that we did that was, we got to analyze a ton of in-game data in order to, kind of optimize that Pixel token afterwards. So, we had some assumptions about the Pixel token, like we had emphasized cosmetics a lot in our original draft of the white paper. And we realized, okay, if we wanted to sufficiently burn that Pixel token just through cosmetics, we would have had to, increase our spend on cosmetics in the game by like 10 to 20x. And that just isn't realistic. So we have to go back to the drawing board, look at all of our, real in-game data and see, okay, where's this token actually the most useful? And we've pinpointed a few areas where we think it's going to be, a big boost in people's gameplay.
Luke, just a follow-up question. You did mention UGC. So I wanted to touch base and get a sense of how UGC works within the Pixels game. And also you mentioned creators can use their own tokens to incentivize different rewards. Can you also tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. So I can kind of go over like the Pixel strategy of how we built, because I think this story helps it make sense. So in order to build our core game, our farmland game, we have built like an entire suite of no code to low code tooling to make our game. So basically everything that you see in the game Pixels is made without code. It's just like a ton of tooling that we've built that was very difficult to build, that hooks up to the blockchain, does all the incentives, the ERC20s, 721s behind the scenes. It's a really cool tech stack. And we've used this to build our own game because it makes our design process so much easier. We can iterate really quickly. We can add new content to the game without pushing new code. We can add new quests, new maps, all that kind of stuff, new NFTs, just like with a click of a button. So then what we've also been doing with that tooling now is we've been using that tooling to help make other games, just us doing it. And we can make a game in like a couple of weeks, which is pretty crazy. We just released this game called New Cyber with this partner project. We have another one coming soon and another one after that. So we kind of wanted to start to use our own tooling to expand our ecosystem like a bit horizontally. And now the next stage of Pixels, which this is why we're so excited about the Pixel token, is we want to open up this tooling to all of our users. And our plan is to essentially open up this tooling like one by one. We have the first UGC tool coming out in, it should be this month. It's an item builder where people can actually make new ERC20s without any code just by uploading an object, and they're going to be able to be used in game. And then kind of the next step of that is creating new worlds and then creating game mechanics and game loops themselves too.
So just a TLDR, so you guys are eventually going for a platform play, or maybe a platform of platform play?
Yeah, exactly. My team's really technical, and we made a decent game. Like our Pixels game is actually hitting like pretty good industry standard retention without the Web3 incentives turned on, where I think our day one is like 34%, our day 7 is something like 25%, our day 28 is like 3.5% retention. So if you stack that up against any Web2 game, we're actually doing pretty decent. But I know our team is even better on the tech side of things. So we're also leaning into our strengths too, where we built a pretty impressive suite of tooling. And we know that if we unlock this, one, it's going to increase our distribution in a way that we couldn't just by ourselves. Now, instead of us being the blocker and creating new content in the game, we kind of remove that blocker. And we also get to really experiment with like the protocol design too, essentially of, using a token to supercharge the growth of projects. And that's what we're most interested in about Web3.
So Luke, one follow-up question I have around this is when we go with UGC and when we are going for a platform or platform play, and since we have a burn mechanism in the game, are you kind of slightly worried that there'll be so much demand for Pixels token that it might crowd out some users? Like, is that internal discussion you guys have had internally?
So that's why we like the idea of Pixel being like a premium currency where it's added on top. So we're actually introducing this new game loop, Pets. And this Pets mechanic is, we get an advantage of being the platform, right? Where we actually get to insert some of our own stuff into all the things getting built on our platform. We want the Pets mechanic to work on basically every game built on our platform. And that's essentially like a premium loop that we can use where it doesn't affect the gameplay of these other core loops of these games. Like Pets is a separate game loop from the farmland loop, but they could be interconnected. We could still have like some form of interoperability where it's like, the food and the crops that you earn in the Pixels farmland game, feed the pets, make them happy. But then these pets can also follow you to New Cyber, to this other project that we're working on, to this other project that we're working on. And, it can be a separate game loop. But yeah, it's a tricky thing with things like this as well too, where, you don't want to price out new users, but you also do want to make sure that you can use this tool effectively in order to grow your platform. So it's definitely something that we think about a lot. That's how we kind of think about this token though. Think about it more as like a premium game loop that can attract users and provide sufficient burn for the people who want to be.
Thanks for the explanation, Luke. I also want to touch base on monetization. I know you guys have also introduced subscription model within the game. I just wanted to get a sense of how that correlates with the in-game economy. What are your thoughts around the monetization, and does it accrue any benefit to the overall community?
Yeah, so one of the biggest unspoken things in Web3 that's a huge issue is bots in Web3 games. I think there was a recent report by this company called UseJigger where they analyzed a bunch of on-chain data about Web3 games, and about 60% of Web3 games are just full of bots, and some games have much more, unfortunately. And that does have very negative effects for the player base and for the game economy too. it's funny because there's all this tokenomics that you can do, right? And there's this theoretical side of tokenomics, but there's also the practical side where if you're not on top of things like botting or cyber attacks, then none of your theoretical tokenomics really matter because these botters are basically going to ruin the ecosystem. So for us to combat that, we could do this game of whack-a-mole, and we've been playing it a lot. We ban bots all the time. We have a ton of bot prevention and a ton of bot detection after the fact. We can normally catch a bot in about like a week, but that's a week of them, being in the game and ecosystem. So our approach is, we're trying it out. We'll see if it works. Our approach is a bit different, where we want to actually attack the economics of bots, where we want to make it not economically viable to bot. If we can catch a bot in a certain amount of time, then what we're doing now is actually we're introducing like a subscription. So the idea is, we charge like not anything huge, like $8 a month or something like that to participate in certain features of our game. We want the core game loop to be free, but we want some of the aspects of like earning to be gated by this subscription, or at least gated in some capacity by the subscription. So we have an $8 subscription per month. We charge like a 3-month minimum. That makes botting less economically viable in like the hundreds of accounts if we're able to catch them within a certain amount of time. So essentially we can kind of buy the amount of time that token is worth versus the earnings per day to ban these bots essentially. And if they come out negative, then they actually have no incentive to be botting anymore, or at least on the quantities that they have. We still might get users that bot 1-to-1, and that's truthfully, maybe I shouldn't say this, but that's not as much of an issue as somebody who's making thousands of accounts, which we're seeing a lot in Web3, where people spin up like 100 accounts a day, 1,000 accounts a day, and cyber attack any rewards program. So for us, you can kind of think about it like a mix of RuneScape or World of Warcraft membership, where we can add some Web3 components on top of it as well, like the earn side of things. But we also can offer just like general in-game perks too. Like for example, people who buy our subscription get more backpack space. They get access to this like exclusive area. So we want value in this subscription beyond just the Web3 side of things, just like legitimate Web2 benefits. But then there's also things that we can do with earn that really put a dent in bad actors as well.
Mo, before I move to the fun side of the segment, which is the rapid fire round, do you have any further questions for Luke in terms of anything technical? I know we made him sweat a bit.
I think he's covered a lot from that perspective. I think sometimes it's nice just to take a step back, and we can understand why so many people are talking about pixels outside of the, well, within the Web3 ecosystem, shall I say. But on the Web3 ecosystem, what do you see sort of as been the evolution of play to earn, and how that's changed your thinking within pixels, and also maybe what some projects are still getting wrong, and some sage advice, essentially condensing what you've been saying in the past 20-25 minutes or so into something we can put into a tweet that you're limited by however many characters it is now without the blue tick.
Yeah. So I think the space generally knows that play to earn is dead in its old form. Like the expectations formed around, previous generations of Web3 gaming probably are not sustainable. But I do think there is a really interesting path of still being able to reward users for good in-game behavior through token incentives that looks different, but still can work. But it really depends on building out a good base of the game. Like the game needs to be fun before you add any token incentives, and thinking about all the rest of the incentive design too. I went really hard on the other end of things where we didn't want to talk about Web3 at all for a long time, but also I do think there is a benefit to Web3 gaming that exists. And I think it's actually not the worst. It's not bad to recognize, hey, this is a Web3 game. It's our advantage against Web2 games, right? These other aspects of ownership, of being able to reward our users. So I think the future of Web3 gaming for me is a mix of good games built with really good incentives. And to me, that's a winning combo.
I love it. Mehdi, that's all on my end. Over to you.
Excellent. Luke, so let's move to our rapid fire round. This is the final segment of the podcast, and we try to keep it fun. So the first question is, how do you see the intersection of AI and gaming?
Yeah, this might be one of my worst qualities internally as a as a founder, where I love what's going on with generative AI in gaming, and I think I bring it up to my team too much. We really want to take advantage of this as much as possible. And we actually do use AI a bit in our own internal tech stack for things like helping us come up with quests. And we've been experimenting with like AI generated pixel art too. What I'm really interested in as well is as we move to UGC, can we make our UGC process even easier with AI assistance? And that's something that we're working with a few other projects when we're launching our UGC tooling to see if we can do an integration with them as well. I think it's amazing. And, I'm really excited about the whole future. When I feel like eventually there's going to be a game where it's just like you type in a prompt or you just like have a game that's completely built for you without doing anything, like, Ready Player Me stuff. It's pretty cool.
So this question was prepared by ChatGPT-4. So what are your favorite Web3 and Web2 games?
Yeah, so it's funny because I didn't think of myself as a gamer because I'm not into first person shooters. I'm not into MOBAs. The kind of game that I got really into is like, it's Stardew Valley. And that's why Pixels looks like Stardew Valley so much. I also played a ton of Vampire Survivors in the last year. Essentially just like casual games where you can chill out and not really think about things. But yeah, I also grew up playing RuneScape like a lot of other people in Web3. So I think that's, set a lot of the ethos of what we're building as well too. I think most people recognize RuneScape as like an early metaverse. And it's definitely influenced my thoughts on like, game economy design and all of that side of things. And in terms of Web3, I don't think Axie Infinity and Sky Mavis get enough credit, if I'm being completely honest, especially like in the current day and age. This team, I think, is extremely talented. I think they've learned things about the space that get overlooked. And I'm seeing the roadmap. I'm seeing the things that they're releasing lately. And I have a ton of respect for what they're doing. And the gameplay improvements that they've made. I know a bunch of people who are playing the game now because they like the game and it's not about the token incentives. And I think they've turned a really interesting leaf where, I'm super excited about their future.
So Luke, what was the last thing you searched on Google or ChatGPT?
Let me look. I think it was kind of funny. I think my last ChatGPT search had something to do with puns. I'm really bad at coming up with puns myself. Me and my friends have this group chat about puns. So I've been cheating a bit. I'm not going to lie. And I had it come up with some puns for me. Maybe not. No.
I told you we'd make you sweat in this podcast. No, fair enough. I have to ask one more question, but I think we know the answer.
Yeah.
Blue ocean or red ocean?
Blue ocean.
I love it. I mean, wow, that was a fun round. Luke, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of the different insights about Pixels and the world of Web3 gaming. We wish you and your team all of the best moving forward. And I can't wait to jump back in and wait till we maybe integrate Mochaverse one day within the Pixels ecosystem. Watch this space.
Make it happen, yeah. Well, no, appreciate you having me on. Really enjoyed this.
This podcast is for information purposes only and should not be considered as financial advice. Any opinions provided in this podcast reflect the views of the speakers only.